imagine you've just survived one of the most devastating, literal meat grinder conflicts in human history.
Right.
I mean, we are talking about an industrial slaughterhouse that lasted 4 years. Your country isn't just defeated, it is physically and, frankly, spiritually in ruins.
Yeah, completely decimated.
And the leaders, right, the people who marched you into this nightmare, they've literally fled in disgrace in the dead of night.
Just packed up and left.
Exactly. And the currency in your pocket is becoming so worthless that people are, using wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread.
It's just wild to even picture.
It really is. The economy is actively collapsing.
Yeah.
Every time you walk down the street, you are seeing these physical reminders of the war amputees, widows, starving children. So how do you even process that level of trauma?
It's almost impossible.
Right. How do you wake up in the morning and just pretend society still exists? Well, interestingly enough, what you do is you go to the movies.
Which, it sounds almost completely absurd when you frame it that way.
It really does.
It's totally counterintuitive. Because when the physical world around you is literally crumbling to dust and you're terrified about where your next meal is coming from, the absolute last thing you'd expect a society to do is retreat into a dark room to watch flickering shadows projected onto a wall.
Right, like who has the time or the money for that?
Exactly. And yet, that is exactly what happened in Germany right after World War I. It wasn't just a distraction, it was a matter of sheer psychological survival.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're stepping into the really dark, twisted, and just fascinating world of the Weimar Republic.
It's quite a trip.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to explore how a completely shattered nation, Germany, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, somehow managed to rebuild its collective psyche on the silver screen.
Which is such a massive undertaking.
It is. So our mission today is to understand how the German Expressionist cinematic style, it was never just about popcorn entertainment.
No, not at all.
It didn't just offer an escape from a terrible reality. It actively shaped the perception of that reality, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It molded historical consciousness, and it provided a highly specific, totally revolutionary visual language for a society dealing with, profound, unspeakable trauma.
It genuinely stands out as one of the most remarkable periods in modern history.
Definitely.
It's this singular moment where high art, cutting-edge technology, and profound national crisis all just slammed into each other to create an entirely new way of seeing the world.
And what's guiding our conversation today, which I'm really excited about, is the work of a researcher named Itay Maor.
Oh, yes, his work is fantastic.
Right. He's from the University of Haifa. But what I find incredibly compelling about his approach is that he isn't just, researching this in some isolated, dusty university library.
No, he's actually out there teaching it.
Exactly. He is a high school cinema teacher. He takes these incredibly dense, complex theories about national trauma, historical memory, and visual aesthetics, and he actually teaches them to teenagers.
Which is, that's no small feat.
Not at all. These are students who are just starting to learn about international film history. And that pedagogical approach, the need to break down the why and the how so clearly that a beginner can suddenly see the matrix of how movies work.
Yeah.
That's exactly the lens we are going to use today. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Let's start with this foundational idea that a movie is never just a movie. We have to treat cinema as an actual historical agent.
That's the perfect starting point, honestly, because to understand Expressionism, you really have to fundamentally change your definition of what cinema actually is.
Beyond just entertainment.
Right. In the early 20th century, a lot of people still thought of film as a gimmick, a novelty, or at best, just a mechanical recording device.
Like pointing a camera at a moving train.
Exactly. You point a camera at a train, you record the train, boom, you have a movie. But the perspective we need to adopt today, which is often referred to as the theory of the seventh art.
Okay, the seventh art.
Yeah, it argues that cinema is a highly complex symbolic creation. It represents the deepest, most closely held social and cultural values of the time it was made.
So it's not just a snapshot.
No, when you sit down to watch a film, you aren't just looking at a moving photograph. You are engaging with a text that operates simultaneously on multiple frequencies.
Which completely changes the viewing experience if you think about it.
Completely.
Because you have the overt layer, obviously, the literal events on screen.
The plot.
Right, the plot.
Okay.
The guy gets the girl, the detective catches the killer, the monster chases the villagers.
Yeah.
But the real meat, especially for cinema students, is the covert layer. It's the hidden assumptions, the background details, the things this society making the film just takes for granted.
Or the things they are too terrified to talk about in polite conversation.
Oh, exactly. And this ties into the concepts developed by historians like Marc Farreau,
right,
who argue that cinema doesn't just passively reflect history.
No, it functions as an active agent of history.
An active agent.
Yeah. Yes. Think about how memory works. Most of what we quote-unquote remember about historical eras we didn't actually live through is heavily dictated by the films made about them or during them. Cinema actively shapes collective memory.
Wow.
It shapes ideological perceptions. The films a society consumes and the ones that become massive hits, they actually dictate how that society remembers who they are and what they value.
I love that concept. It really makes me think of cinema as a kind of cultural Trojan horse.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. You buy your ticket, you sit in the dark, and you let your guard down because you think, oh, I'm just watching a scary movie about a vampire or a sleepwalking murderer.
You're just there for a good time.
Exactly. But while you were distracted by the jump scares, you were actually absorbing the collective anxieties, the political dread, and the unspoken traumas of an entire generation.
It bypasses your rational brain entirely.
It really does. It slips right past your conscious defenses.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, this is exactly why teaching film to beginners, like Itay does with his high school students,
right,
why it's such a powerful critical exercise. You have to train the eye.
You can't just watch passively.
Exactly. You aren't just critiquing whether the lighting looked cool or if the lead actor delivered a believable performance. You are forensically analyzing the film as a symbolic text.
Unearthing the underlying structure.
Yes. You're trying to find the moral panics and the political realities of that specific time and place. A film is undoubtedly a product of its sociocultural environment, but it simultaneously acts as a machine that creates and reinforces that very environment.
Which brings us to a massive, just unavoidable question.
Lay on me.
If cinema is this powerful mirror reflecting the environment, what exactly was the environment in Germany that gave birth to German Expressionism?
Yeah.
Because if you look at these films, I mean, they are not light, fluffy, optimistic pieces of media.
Not even close.
They are dark, twisted, paranoid, and frankly, deeply terrifying.
They are undeniably nightmare-inducing. And to understand why that art looks the way it does, we have to look unflinchingly at the trauma that served as its catalyst.
The war.
We have to rewind to the cataclysm of World War I, the Great War. We throw around terms like devastating a lot, but the sheer scale of the carnage is just difficult to overstate.
It's hard to grasp.
It really is. We are talking about a conflict that resulted in approximately 10 million dead and another 20 million severely wounded.
10 million dead. It's one of those statistics that is so massive, so beyond human scale, that the brain kind of just shuts down.
It becomes an abstraction.
Exactly. But for the people living through it, it wasn't an abstraction at all. Every single person in the country knew someone who was killed, maimed, or missing.
Yes. And this created what historians and artists alike called the lost generation.
Right.
This was an entire demographic of young people, primarily men under the age of 40, who were simply wiped off the map. Entire towns lost their youth.
That's horrifying.
But the trauma wasn't solely in the staggering death toll. It was in the fundamental nature of the war itself. World War I was a total war.
Which fundamentally changed the contract between the citizen and the state, didn't it?
Very much so.
Because it wasn't just professional armies lining up in a field hundreds of miles away while the folks back home went about their normal business, maybe, reading a newspaper update once a week.
Far from it. Total war blurred the lines completely between the front lines and the home front. Every single resource, every factory, every citizen's daily labor, every aspect of the national economy was cannibalized and fed into this insatiable war machine for 4 agonizing years.
It consumed everything.
People at home were starving due to blockades. They were working themselves to the bone to produce artillery shells. And then, after all that unimaginable sacrifice...
After gutting their own country.
Right. Germany was comprehensively and utterly defeated, and the ultimate salt in the wound was the leadership.
Oh, the Kaiser.
Yes. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who had pushed them into this conflict, abdicated his throne and fled to Holland in late 1918.
He literally just packed his bags and skipped town. He left the country to burn.
He abandoned them entirely. He left behind a nation that was in total economic ruin, facing crippling reparations from the Treaty of Versailles and experiencing a profound spiritual collapse.
So the people just felt betrayed.
A toxic, overwhelming sense of betrayal. For the citizens, and especially for the returning soldiers, they felt that their immense sacrifices, their horrific physical injuries from shrapnel and mustard gas, and the agonizing deaths of their friends in the trenches were completely in vain. For years, the government propaganda had promised them a righteous, glorious victory.
And instead, they got ruined.
Instead, they woke up to find they had been led into a pointless slaughter by leaders who ultimately cut and run.
So, okay, if you are a citizen in this society, you are grieving, you are likely starving, your money is literally worthless, and you are boiling with a righteous, furious anger at your own government and military establishment.
Yeah, that's the baseline.
How does a society even begin to function with that level of collective nationwide PTSD? Because there is no going back to normal, right? The pre-war normal was obliterated by artillery fire.
There is absolutely no going back. And this exact friction, this massive, unbridgeable chasm between the grim, humiliating reality of a defeated nation and the innate human need to somehow process and articulate that horror, this is what created the incredibly fertile ground for a completely new artistic movement. The trauma of the trenches and the betrayal of the state demanded a radically new visual language.
Because the old language, like the old way of making art, it just felt like a lie.
Precisely. Before the war, traditional realism was the dominant mode. Art was largely supposed to accurately, objectively depict the physical world as it is.
Painting pretty landscapes.
Right. But after 1918, realism felt entirely inadequate. It felt dishonest. If the real world has become a nightmare of muddy trenches, chemical weapons, and thousands of young men with missing limbs begging on the streets of Berlin,
then painting a bowl of fruit doesn't quite cut it.
Exactly. Filming a straightforward, logical drama feels profoundly offensive. The internal psychological breakdown of the German nation required an external visual language that was equally broken, distorted, and extreme.
That is such a crucial point. When reality itself feels insane, realistic art loses all its power.
It really does.
But here is the historical paradox that completely blows my mind.
What's that?
Usually, when a country is absolutely bankrupt, right, when they have just lost a massive war, the government is dealing with hyperinflation, and there are literal street battles between political factions.
Right, chaos.
The arts are the very first thing to get cut. The government slashes the arts budget immediately to pay for infrastructure or debt or just to keep the lights on.
Sure, that's standard.
But in Germany, during this chaotic Weimar Republic era, the exact opposite happened.
It is a stunning historical anomaly. Starting right at the end of 1918, as the war was concluding and the fragile Weimar Republic was being stitched together, the German government didn't cut arts funding.
They doubled down.
They actively and heavily subsidized the narrative film industry. They threw immense financial support behind a massive, centralized film studio known as UFA.
Universum Film Aktiengesellschaft, right?
That's the one.
Which is just wild to me. Why would a bankrupt, deeply unpopular government spend its incredibly scarce resources on building massive movie studios?
Because it was a highly calculated strategic move.
Yeah.
The newly formed Weimar government was desperate. They needed to rehabilitate Germany's devastated image, both internationally and domestically.
Because they were the bad guys.
Globally, they were the ultimate pariahs. They were entirely blamed for the war, and their exports were boycotted. Domestically, the population had zero faith in the new republic.
Right.
So the government realized they needed soft power. They saw cinema not as a luxury, but as a powerful modern public relations tool.
PR.
The idea was, if we can produce high-quality, sophisticated, modern films, we can show the world and our own angry citizens that Germany is still a cultured, advanced, and enlightened nation.
Not just a militaristic monster.
Exactly.
So essentially, the government sets out to fund a giant tourism ad.
Kind of, yeah.
But here is where it gets incredibly fascinating and frankly kind of hilarious in a dark way. It's like they launched this massive government PR campaign, but they gave the money to traumatized artists.
Yes.
So the campaign accidentally goes completely rogue. The politicians wanted good PR. They wanted to look put together and sophisticated.
Really respectable art.
But the artists took that state funding, used those state-of-the-art studios, and created a dark, twisted, horrific mirror showing the country exactly how broken its soul actually was.
It's true.
It's like a government trying to fund a heartwarming family drama and accidentally financing Black Mirror.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it's completely accurate. The state backing, ironically, created a totally unprecedented era of artistic freedom.
Because they had the money, but no real oversight.
Because UFA and other studios had massive funding, and their only real mandate was to be, quote-unquote, innovative and world-class. Berlin transformed into this booming avant-garde hub of creativity.
Wow.
The filmmakers weren't heavily censored aesthetically because the government politicians largely didn't understand the visual metaphors.
They just saw weird shapes and went, sure, very modern.
Exactly. The government just wanted the studios to produce culturally significant work that would impress the French and the Americans enough to break the international boycott against German goods.
So the government is essentially blindly funding its own psychological and political critique.
Yes.
Because they are only looking at the overt layer of the film, not the covert layer.
Exactly. And this is how cinema became a central daily ritual in modern German life. The public flocked to these newly designed, massive, beautiful movie palaces in Berlin.
But they weren't just going for cheap thrills.
No, or mindless escapism. They were engaging in a massive sensory and intellectual dialogue about the nature of their society. They were using these state-funded films to create a shared historical consciousness. When you have 1,000 people sitting in a dark room together, watching a visual representation of madness and betrayal, they are actively processing their national trauma in the dark as a community.
Which is such a powerful image. The cinema as a community healing space.
Exactly.
But to really understand how they managed to process this trauma, we have to pop the hood and look at the actual visual mechanics of these films.
Yes, the aesthetics.
Because they didn't just film actors sitting around a table talking about how sad they were about the war. They invented a completely new way of seeing. They built a new visual vocabulary from scratch.
And this brings us to the core mechanics of the aesthetic. If you are a teacher like Itay Maor, trying to explain to a student how to spot a German expressionist film from a single frame.
Yeah, what do you look for?
You have to break down the technical markers. What does madness actually look like on screen?
Right. So if we were going to draw this out on a chalkboard for a Film 101 class, what are the absolute undeniable signatures of this style?
The primary overriding rule is a complete, intentional, and aggressive departure from realism.
Okay. Anti-realism.
The directors and set designers fundamentally did not want the film to look like the actual physical world. To achieve this anti-realism, they used highly specific techniques. And the most famous is extreme lighting, specifically a technique called chiaroscuro.
Chiaroscuro. Break that down for us. What does chiaroscuro actually do on a technical level?
So chiaroscuro is the use of stark, violent contrast between blinding, harsh light and deep, impenetrable shadow.
Like no in between.
Right. In the real world, lighting is usually diffused, right? You have lots of soft grays, gentle gradients, ambient light bouncing around a room.
Sure.
Expressionist lighting eliminates the gray. It uses intense focused spotlights, often carbon arc lamps, which were incredibly bright and harsh to blast the subject, leaving everything else in absolute pitch blackness.
Then what does that do to the viewer? Because it's not just a stylistic choice. It physically affects how you watch the movie, right?
Absolutely. When there are no gray tones, when the contrast is that aggressive, it physically forces the human eye to strain.
Oh, wow.
Your pupil is trying to adjust to the blinding light and the pitch black simultaneously. This creates a physiological sense of tension and unease in the viewer before the actors even do anything.
That's brilliant.
It makes the world feel hostile and unsafe. The shadows aren't just the absence of light. They become active, malevolent entities. They stretch out. They loom over characters. They literally seem to creep up the walls to swallow people whole.
And they pair this hostile lighting with incredibly bizarre camera work, too.
Yes.
We take moving cameras for granted now.
Yeah.
But back then, they were actively choosing to shoot from completely unnatural angles.
Exactly. The camera angles were deeply unsettling. They would shoot from a very low angle looking up, making characters or buildings look tyrannical and monstrously large.
To make you feel small.
Right. Or they would shoot from a high angle looking down, making characters look weak, trapped, and oppressed. They were physically distorting the perspective of the audience to match the distorted psychological state of the characters.
But, you know, the lighting and the camera angles are really just the icing on the cake compared to the set design.
Oh, the sets are legendary.
This is what everyone remembers about Expressionism. The highly artificial, prominent, entirely handcrafted sets They didn't shoot on real streets. They built these insane, impossible worlds indoors.
That is the defining hallmark. The buildings in these films are literally crooked.
Yeah.
The doors are slanted at impossible angles. The staircases lead to nowhere or seem to defy gravity. The streets wind in these jagged, unnatural, claustrophobic geometries. Nothing is plumb, nothing is level, nothing makes architectural sense.
I always think about the absolute seminal masterpiece of this era, the 1920 film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Wein.
The classic.
If you just look at a single still frame from that movie, it looks like you are staring into a schizophrenic hallucination.
It really does.
The walls of the town look like they are actively collapsing inward on the characters. And they went so far as to literally paint jagged shadows directly onto the floors and the walls of the set.
They didn't even rely entirely on lighting.
Exactly. They painted the darkness right into the architecture.
Caligari is the quintessential textbook example, and it perfectly illustrates the central mechanism of Expressionism. These wild, jagged sets were not just artists trying to be avant-garde or weird for the sake of being weird.
Right. Had purpose.
These visual elements were highly precise psychological tools. The theory is that the physical environment is an outward projection of the internal mental state.
Okay, wow.
The distorted, jagged sets represented a violently distorted psychological reality. The harsh, painted shadows literally represented the inescapable darkness of the post-war German psyche.
So the set is a character.
Exactly. Expressionism completely shifted the cinematic center of gravity. In a traditional film, the focus is entirely on the plot. What are the characters doing? In Expressionism, the focus is placed heavily onto the visual aesthetics. How does the world feel?
The environment itself is a lead character.
Yes.
I want to pause here, though, and look at this from a skeptical perspective.
Okay, play devil's advocate.
If you have a nation that is deeply traumatized by a horrific war, and they are grieving millions of dead sons and brothers, why not just make realistic, sad movies about soldiers returning home to a broken country?
It's a fair question.
Right. Why go through the incredible expense and effort to build crooked, jagged towns and invent monsters and mad scientists? Why not just deal with the trauma directly and honestly?
It's a great question, but dealing with it directly was often completely impossible for two massive reasons. One psychological and one political.
Okay, let's hear.
Psychologically, realism was simply inadequate. If you film a realistic movie about a sad soldier in a normal-looking house, it doesn't convey the visceral, screaming madness that people actually felt inside.
It's too subdued.
Right. The external reality of a living room doesn't match the internal reality of a mind shattered by artillery fire.
So the crazy sets actually felt more true to their experience than a realistic set would have.
Exactly. It captured the feeling of madness. But the second reason is political, and this goes back to the idea of the film as a covert text. Directors desperately needed a way to bypass direct, literal political censorship.
Of course.
If you make a realistic movie in 1920 criticizing the German generals for sending millions of men to die, or criticizing the current government for the hyperinflation,
You get shut down.
you face massive political backlash. You face literal censorship. The studio might shut you down, or the audience might reject the film entirely because it is simply too painful, too literal, and too close to home.
It's too on the nose. It triggers their defenses.
Yeah, exactly. But expressionist imagery was a genius way to express deep, collective anxiety covertly. By making the world look chaotic, exaggerated, and mad through the set design, lighting, and monster narratives, they accurately depicted how the world felt to a German citizen without ever having to say a single subversive word about the Kaiser or the Weimar politicians.
That is so clever.
The environment itself was screaming that something was fundamentally structurally wrong with society. The authorities couldn't censor a shadow or a slanted door, but the audience understood the message perfectly.
It is absolutely brilliant. It's like they managed to smuggle a massive nationwide therapy session and a blistering political critique inside the Trojan horse of a spooky ghost story.
That's exactly what they did.
And it worked, didn't it? I mean, Caligari wasn't just some niche art house experiment. It was a massive commercial blockbuster.
It was a global phenomenon. Its hypnotic, mystical, and utterly bizarre charm captivated audiences not just in Berlin, but worldwide.
Even outside Germany.
Yes. It was so visually arresting, so completely unlike anything anyone had ever seen, that it actually helped break the international boycott against German films.
No way.
The French and the Americans were still holding deep anti-German sentiment from the war, but they were so mesmerized by this revolutionary visual language that they simply had to watch it.
Which means the Weimar government's desperate PR plan to use film for soft power actually worked.
Ironically, yes.
But it only worked because the artists completely ignored the mandate to make something respectable, and instead made something so profoundly weird, dark, and true to their trauma that the world couldn't look away.
It's a great irony of history.
And it's crucial to note that it wasn't just the architecture that was mad. The characters that inhabited these crooked buildings were fundamentally broken, too. The story's completely changed.
Absolutely. The narrative themes shifted just as dramatically as the lighting.
How so?
Well, pre-war German society prided itself on rationality, logic, order, and scientific progress.
Right. Very structured.
But the war proved that all of that rationality just led to more efficient ways to slaughter people. So the films completely abandoned rationality.
They went the other way.
They dove headfirst into the irrational. They began exploring deep psychology, ancient myths, dark folklore, intense, uncontrollable passion, and the terrifying mysteries of life, death, and destiny.
So if a student is watching these films, what kind of protagonists are they actually seeing? Who are the heroes in an expressionist film?
There rarely are traditional heroes.
Really?
The characters are almost always on the absolute brink of madness, if not completely violently over the edge. You don't have brave knights or clever detectives.
So who do you have?
You have helpless sleepwalkers who are controlled by malicious hypnotic authorities. You have mad scientists playing God. You have fractured identities, doppelgangers, murderers driven by uncontrollable impulses, and literal vampires bringing plague.
Wow.
The characters are walking, breathing symbolic texts representing the total mental breakdown of the German nation.
Let's talk about that sleepwalker metaphor, because to me, this is the ultimate aha moment.
It really is.
When you decode this, it changes everything. In the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, you have Dr. Caligari, this creepy authoritarian figure, and he controls Caesar, a somnambulist, a sleepwalker.
Yes.
Caesar doesn't want to hurt anyone, but Caligari hypnotizes him, keeps him in a coffin-like cabinet, wakes him up, and forces him to go out into the night and commit brutal murders against his will.
It's a tragic story.
And you don't have to look very hard to see the political allegory there, do you?
It is arguably the most famous political allegory in cinema history. Dr. Caligari is the German state, the generals, the Kaiser, the politicians.
And Caesar.
Caesar, the tragic, helpless sleepwalker forced to kill against his nature, is the German youth.
Oh, wow.
He is the young soldier, hypnotized by propaganda, conscripted by the state, and sent into the trenches to murder other young men. The film is a blistering critique of authoritarianism and blind obedience, but because it's dressed up as a spooky carnival story, it bypassed the censors entirely.
It is a perfect, devastating metaphor. And it makes total sense why these directors insisted on filming almost entirely inside controlled studios rather than going out to a real forest or a real street.
They had to. They were mapping the internal, subjective landscape of the human mind. And you can't control the sun or the wind.
Right. Reality's too unpredictable.
Exactly. By staying in the massive UFA studios, they had absolute dictatorial control over every single shadow, every beam of light, and every angle of the set.
To make sure it all matched the metaphor.
They needed that total control to ensure that every single frame reflected this internal psychological claustrophobia. The studio itself became a metaphor for the trapped, isolated German mind.
It wasn't just Robert Wiene doing this with Caligari. There were several massive visionary masterminds operating during this era who codified this language.
Indeed. Directors like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau took these concepts and pushed them to incredible heights.
Oh, Murnau was legendary.
Murnau gave us Nosferatu in 1922, which was an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula. But his vampire, Count Orlok, isn't a suave aristocrat in a cape.
No, he's terrifying.
He looks like a walking corpse, a literal rat-like bringer of plague and death, completely infiltrating and destroying a helpless society. It's a clear echo of the devastation the war brought to the home front.
And then Fritz Lang gave us Metropolis a few years later.
Yes, Metropolis took expressionist design and applied it to science fiction. He created a towering, oppressive, nightmare city where the working class is literally fed into the gaping, fiery jaws of industrial machines.
Which is just a horrific visual echo of soldiers being fed into the industrial meat grinder of the Western Front.
Exactly. Lang and Murnau used these extreme characters and environments to explore profound qualities of German identity, fate, and destiny. They were desperately trying to help a nation find meaning and a sense of self after the total collapse of their previous societal structures.
But as we know from history, this incredible, explosive, state-funded era of creativity and profound self-reflection had a very definitive, very dark, and very abrupt ending.
Tragically, yes.
It didn't just slowly fade out of fashion.
No. The golden era of Weimar Republic cinema and all the artistic freedom that came with it was violently terminated in January 1933.
With the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seizing total power.
Yes. The Nazi regime immediately and violently suppressed this kind of artistic freedom. They completely took over the UFA studios.
They didn't want the critique anymore.
The Nazis demanded cinema that served as pure propaganda. They wanted heroic realism, optimistic stories, and a total glorification of the state and the Aryan ideal.
The exact opposite of Expressionism.
Exactly. The highly subjective, deeply psychological, pessimistic, and politically critical nature of Expressionism was officially labeled as degenerate art. It was considered dangerous to the new totalitarian state.
Because it encouraged questioning the state.
Yes. The visionary artists who created this movement were either silenced or, in the case of people like Fritz Lang, forced to flee the country for their lives.
But here's the beautiful thing about art and visual language. When you create a tool that is that powerful, a visual vocabulary for expressing profound human trauma and alienation that is that effective, it doesn't just disappear because a dictator outlaws it. You cannot put that genie back in the bottle.
You really can't.
The aesthetic goes dormant, it crosses borders, it mutates, and it eventually resurfaces.
And that is precisely the legacy of Expressionism. It's scattered like seeds in the wind, both internationally and eventually back in Germany itself.
Okay, let's talk about that return.
If we fast forward a few decades past the horrors of the Second World War into the 1960s and 70s, we see a massive, fascinating revival. This movement becomes known as the New German Cinema.
Which is incredible, because history is repeating itself. A generation later, Germany is once again dealing with the total destruction of their country, the horrors of the Holocaust, a partitioned nation, and the need to rebuild their identity after another devastating war.
The parallels are striking.
So how did this new generation of filmmakers in the 60s and 70s connect back to the Expressionists of the 1920s?
Well, even down to the funding, it was similar. This new wave was sparked by new production budgets, this time largely supported by West German television and state grants.
So once again, the state is subsidizing the art.
Exactly, which functioned almost identically to the state support UFA received in the 1920s. The state was once again subsidizing the art to help rebuild the culture and process the national guilt.
Wow.
The key figures of this new wave directors, like Werner, Herzog, Wenders, and Werner Fassbinder, they essentially inherited the Expressionist DNA.
They grew up in that shadow.
Yes, and they adapted that visual and thematic language for a modern era.
But how did they adapt it? Because if you look at a movie from the 70s, they aren't painting harsh black shadows on the floor of a studio anymore.
No, they weren't doing that.
So how are they keeping that very specific Expressionist spirit alive without just copying the sets?
They kept the thematic, psychological core, but they completely changed the physical mechanics. Take Werner Herzog, for example.
Okay, Herzog.
Herzog is deeply obsessed with the core Expressionist themes. The mystery of fate, characters driven to the absolute brink of madness by obsession, and highly subjective, distorted descriptions of reality.
Right.
But instead of locking his actors in a claustrophobic painted soundstage in Berlin, he took his cameras out into wild, untamed nature.
Right, he goes to the Amazon rainforest or the Sahara Desert.
Exactly. In films like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, or Fitzcarraldo, the hostile, overwhelming, uncontrollable force of the jungle literally replaces the jagged, painted architecture of Caligari.
Oh, that's so interesting. So nature is the distorted set?
Yes. The physical landscape becomes the psychological mirror. The endless, impenetrable river and the oppressive heat reflect the internal madness and megalomania of the characters. He took the internal psychological landscape and mapped it onto the actual physical geography of the world.
That is a brilliant evolution. What about Werner Fassbinder? He took a very different approach, didn't he?
He did. Fassbinder looked inward, adapting a very theatrical, highly stage-like cinematic approach.
Or more like the originals.
Yes, his films often feel incredibly confined. He shot in small apartments or bars, using highly stylized artificial lighting and rigid camera movements.
Very claustrophobic.
Exactly. He focused intensely on interpersonal cruelty, social traumas, and the alienation of marginalized people in post-war Germany. By making his spaces feel artificial and suffocating, he was directly echoing the controlled, inescapable environments of the Weimar studios.
And then you have Wenders, who I find really interesting because he serves as a kind of bridge. What was Wenders' specific approach to this legacy?
Wenders created a truly unique synthesis. He was heavily influenced by the heavy philosophical and psychological roaming of his German Expressionist predecessors.
Okay.
But he was also deeply enamored with the metaphorical style of the American film industry. So he blended the two.
How does that look?
Well, in films like Paris, Texas, or The American Friend, he takes the deep existential alienation of the German tradition and sets it against the vast, empty aesthetics of the American road movie.
Oh, wow.
The empty deserts and neon-lit highways of America become his expressionist landscapes, vast, lonely voids reflecting the disconnected souls of his characters.
I really want to pull on that thread of the American connection, actually.
Sure.
Because if you were teaching this to a modern audience, or if Itay Maor is teaching this to his high school students...
Yeah, you need a modern touch point.
Exactly. The easiest way to make them understand Weimar Germany is to point them to modern Hollywood. So how does a student connect a 1920s silent film from Berlin to modern American pop culture?
There is a very direct, undeniable visual lineage here, and the most famous modern practitioner of this is Tim Burton.
Oh, of course, Tim Burton.
When you look at Tim Burton's entire visual aesthetic, the stark, harsh shadows, the pale, tragic characters with dark, sunken eyes, the impossibly crooked Gothic architecture in films like Edward Scissorhands, Batman Returns, or The Nightmare Before Christmas, you are looking at a direct, loving homage to German Expressionism.
It's almost copy-pasted in some respects. I mean, the character of Edward Scissorhands looks remarkably like Cesar, the sleepwalker from Caligari.
The resemblance is entirely intentional. Burton took the visual language that was invented to process the horrific trauma of the trenches in 1920s Germany, and he successfully adapted it into modern, dark, American fairy tales.
That's fascinating.
He uses that exact same aesthetic of jagged lines and heavy shadows to convey feelings of profound alienation, loneliness, and the struggle of the outsider in modern pastel-colored suburbia.
Wow, so the visual tool still works.
It proves just how incredibly durable and effective that specific style is at conveying psychological struggle, even nearly a century later and continents away. The language works just as well to describe the alienation of a modern teenager as it did a traumatized war veteran.
That is the mark of true, lasting art. So as we pull back and look at this entire century-long arc, what does this all mean for us today?
It's a big question.
We've traveled from the muddy, bloody trenches of World War I through the heavily subsidized, shadowy studios of 1920s Berlin, into the chaotic jungles of Werner Herzog's films, and finally into the Gothic American pop culture of Tim Burton.
I think this raises an important question about the fundamental purpose of art. It shows us the incredibly cyclical nature of trauma and healing.
Right.
The state-subsidized films of the new German cinema in the 60s and 70s finally managed to complete the work that the Weimar films of the 1920s started.
They brought it full circle.
They created a unique, deeply personal, undeniably powerful cinematic language that successfully exported German culture and their incredibly complex, painful historical reckoning to the United States and the rest of the world.
So they finally achieved that soft power.
Exactly. They proved unequivocally that cinema is not just entertainment. It is perhaps the single most powerful tool a society possesses to look itself in the mirror, to acknowledge its darkest monsters, and to try, desperately, to understand its own horrific history.
It is truly a masterclass in dealing with national crisis. So to summarize this incredible journey for everyone listening, out of the literal ashes and mass death of World War I and the profound, unspeakable grief of the lost generation, a bankrupt government's desperate attempt at good public relations accidentally funded one of the most radical, subversive artistic movements in human history.
Perfectly stated.
By completely stripping away realism. By inventing extreme chiaroscuro lighting, by building impossibly distorted sets, and by focusing on characters teetering on the edge of utter madness, German Expressionism created a covert visual language for trauma.
It did.
It successfully bypassed political censorship to speak directly to the broken soul of a nation. And in doing so, it forever changed how cinema operates, transforming it from a mere recording device into an active, shaping agent of history.
It taught us that when the real world goes completely insane, realism is a lie. Sometimes the only possible way to tell the truth about a mad world is to paint a mad picture.
Exactly. Which totally flips how we should consume media today. So to you listening, the next time you sit in the dark and watch a movie, whether it's an indie horror film or a massive blockbuster,
pay attention.
And you notice harsh, creeping shadows, tilted camera angles that make you feel slightly nauseous, or a protagonist slowly losing their grip on reality. Remember what you're actually seeing.
It's not just a trick of the light.
You are not just looking at cool special effects. You are looking at the direct artistic descendants of a generation of traumatized survivors who are desperately trying to invent a way to make sense of a completely shattered world.
And, I would leave you with a final thought to mull over, applying this historical lens to our modern world.
Okay, let's hear it.
If cinema is indeed the seventh art that acts as a covert mirror for society's deepest hidden anxieties, what do the most popular, visually extreme, and chaotic films of our current era reveal about us?
Ooh, that's a good question.
When we look at the blockbusters of today, what are the covert, unspoken traumas that we are collectively trying to process in the dark? What are our modern monsters trying to tell us about the state of our own society?
That is a question that will absolutely keep me up tonight.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep watching closely, keep questioning the hidden meanings in the media you consume, and we will catch you next time.